What's up, legends, and welcome to the first of 3 Unmatched Marvel Teen Spirit First Impressions videos. Now, this might be the second time some of you are watching this Cloak and Dagger one, but I'll explain that more at the end. And for everyone else watching this for the first time, welcome. In this first impression type video, I basically go over my thoughts. I don't know if you heard that click. That was my ankle cracking. I go over and there's the other one. I go over my initial thoughts on newly released heroes, and this video is being made with like a handful of plays as and against these characters, so my opinions and predictions are probably not super accurate, dare I say wrong even, but that's the entertaining part because you can then compare it to what you think, and then a year from now we can watch this video and see how horribly wrong I was about everything and anything with these characters. So I'm just going to go through the characters, their abilities, and all their cards, and then tell you what I think at the end. Fun times for all. This is Cloak and Dagger. We're going to start with their card back. Cloak, the dark, shadowy, mysterious figure in, you guessed it, the jacket. And Dagger, not wearing a knife, but she is about light, and I think she just shoots light daggers. I don't want to say out of her hands, but maybe she uses a web shooter like Spider-Man. I love the art in this set. Heather, who also did the Buffy set art, was the artist for this set, and I think she nailed the aesthetic of this set. I think both sets in general, just her art style works really well. I'm a big fan of the art, especially for Cloak and Dagger. They are, I'm going to make me sound biased, but they're my favorite hero of the set, so the art definitely helps with that. So Cloak and Dagger, they are a dual hero. They are both melee, and they both have 8 health and share a move value of 2. Let's quickly check the rulebook for what it says about dual heroes, because a little bit has changed since the last time we spoke about dual heroes being the Raptors. So, Cloak and Dagger, dual heroes. Cloak and Dagger are a pair of fighters. Each fighter is a separate hero with their own health dial. If something affects a player's hero, you choose whether it affects Cloak or Dagger. Now, the you, I think, is the Cloak and Dagger player, I believe. I think that was confirmed, but I'm not entirely sure, and someone in the comments can correct me if that's wrong. When either Cloak or Dagger is defeated, remove them from the board like any other fighter. However, you can only lose the game if both are defeated. So that's how dual heroes work. Just like the Raptors, for your opponent to win, they have to kill all of your fighters, not just one. And this is actually a rule change. It used to be whenever an effect targeted your hero, like Sherlock's Confirmed Suspicion or Bloody Mary's Stolen Memories, all of your fighters, all of your heroes, would take that damage. They changed it now, so now only one of your fighters takes that damage. And in those niche matchups where your opponent has cards that affect your hero, this is a huge buff. It makes the Raptors like maybe even just like a counter, like a straight up counter to Sherlock. And obviously it makes the Bloody Mary matchup a little bit better for them. And so I just assume that Cloak and Dagger will benefit in those matchups in the same way that the Raptors do. So their abilities are, they have 2 abilities, Umbra and Refraction. Umbra says, after you attack, if Cloak dealt at least 2 combat damage, your opponent discards 1 card. And Refraction says, after you attack, if Dagger dealt at least 2 combat damage, gain 1 action. These abilities are super spicy. It basically means whenever you attack and you win by at least 2 damage, you get some additional effect. And these can be pretty devastating. Umbra, discarding a card from your opponent, is insane. Think about how valuable and annoying discards are to characters like Medusa and Sherlock and Yanenga. Now, some of those discards are random. Some of them are like choice discards, and some of them are just like your opponent is discarding a card, but they get to choose instead of choosing whether or not they get to discard a card, like in the case of Shield Formation. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Basically, discarding a card, is bad. You only have 30 cards. Most characters don't have ways to recur cards from their discard pile, so a card lost is normally a card your opponent is not getting back. And depending on how good their deck is and or their hand is at the time when they have to discard a card, you can mess them up pretty severely. It's really good for pressuring your opponent if they're playing at a low hand count, because then a discard matters even more. And if you discard like at least 4 or 5 cards with this ability, that's just an insane amount of value, and anything else is absolutely crazy. I think Umbra is a really good early game and mid game ability that kind of makes the pace of the game like a lot more grindy and value based for you. And I think that's good because Refraction is more of like an end game combo finisher ability. Gaining a bunch of actions is really good, especially against characters that can't value block. Well, both of these abilities are good against characters that can't value block, but Dagger especially, if you can just chuck like 4 or 5 attacks at your opponent to just finish them off and you just gain the actions right back, that can be incredibly lethal against certain characters. And like I said, I like Refraction as like an end game finisher, just because some of the cards you're playing as Dagger do not make her last very long in the game. So I really like using Umbra consistently in the mid to early game to weaken your opponent, make them waste a bunch of cards, and then when they are properly softened and tenderized like a nice chicken roast, you just put the nail in the coffin and you fract the chicken a little bit. That metaphor didn't quite pan out, but hopefully you see what I'm saying. Both of these abilities are absolutely crazy. And I should say that Cloak and Dagger being a dual hero, they work a lot better when they are both alive. Obviously because they have some card effects that like revolve around having them both alive, and just the flexibility of being able to choose whether you're going for Umbra or Refraction is better than if Dagger dies early and then it's just discards for the rest of the game, when maybe it's a matchup where you really needed to just chain a bunch of actions to kill your opponent. So keep that in mind when you're playing Cloak and Dagger. Probably should keep them both alive for as long as possible, but I really love these abilities. 8 health. Obviously there are sidekicks in the game with more health than them, but I don't think it's as bad as it looks, because they have healing cards and they also have ways to manipulate their health, as in the low HP character and the high HP character. The high HP character can give some of their HP to the low HP character. So it isn't as horrible as it seems, although it does make them vulnerable to more bursty characters that will either just have a bunch of auto damage or can deal a bunch of damage in just a few attacks. So there probably will be some matchups that they don't do well in because of that, but overall I don't think it's too much of a detriment. So let's take a look at some of their cards. The first card is Oxform. This is a Dagger only printed 7 attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. And it says, this card's effects cannot be canceled. After combat, if you won the combat, your fighter takes damage equal to the amount of damage you dealt. So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, printed 7s are crazy, because if your opponent doesn't have some sort of way to make their defense card increase in value or make yours decrease in value, a lot of times this is going to be 3 or 4 damage over the top of their card, which is great for closing out a game. If your opponent is at a low enough health threshold, you just chuck this at them, and normally there might not be something they can do. The effect, however, it kind of brings this card down to earth. It's like Oxform, where it says this card's effects cannot be canceled, because the effect is actually a downside, and not being able to cancel it is kind of a way to make it balanced, because in Oxform, your opponent can then boost their defense card. In this case of Light Force Barrage, Dagger will be taking some damage based on how much she dealt. And with only 8 health, that's not good. If you're going to be dealing 3 or 4 damage over the top with this card, you don't want to be taking 3 or 4 damage when your max HP is 8. If you're at full health, you'll go down to 5 or 4, and if you were lower than that, you might even end up defeating yourself. So this is a good card to save for the end of the game when it doesn't matter if Dagger gets defeated, either because you have Cloak or because it's the rule where if you and your opposing hero are both defeated on the same turn, the person whose turn it was wins anyway. So definitely a nice endgame card. Although it is nice to know that Refraction will basically almost always trigger with this card because 5 value blocks are very hard to come by. And unless it's something like a Bewilderment, you're usually going to be dealing at least 2 damage with this card. So it's a really good end game win condition. If you just have 2 of these in your hand, you can just chuck them both at your opponent and gain the action back and they'll probably die. So definitely a risky card. Don't want to play this turn 1, but it does create some interesting mind games with how your opponent blocks Dagger and whether or not they just like play a regrouper, take it undefended, knowing that if they think it's a Light Force Barrage, the Dagger will then take 7 damage, and maybe that's like a worthy trade in their eyes. But it's a crazy card. It's not amazing, but I think it's still great. But it also fits into my risk-reward play style, so who knows. The next card is a Cloak-specific card called Dark Force Dimension. It is a 4-value attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies, and it says, after combat, place the opposing fighter in any space. Your opponent discards 1 card. So 4-value attacks, kind of like the standard, and the effect is really good. Placing the opposing fighter in any space is just awesome movement. There's basically no restriction on it, and you can move the opponent wherever you want, whether that be into a pin between Cloak and Dagger, next to Dagger so that she can attack second action and hopefully pull out some shenanigans, or just moving them to the other side of the Puke on Death Loop so that they double maneuver with a full hand or something. Numerous possibilities, and they're all good. Controlling where your opponent goes is a very nice effect to have. And the discard effect is also really good because it means that if your opponent feints this card to try to avoid the discard, well, this will still deal 2 damage over the top and make them discard a card anyway with Umbra. And if they value block it, well, they're still discarding a card with this effect. And God forbid they play like a 2-value block that doesn't cancel your effect, like Little Red's What Big Mouth You Have. Well, Little Red will then be discarding 2 cards to this card effect, which is... It's bonkers good. They say the only scenario where your opponent isn't discarding a card from this card is something like It's Just Your Imagination or Super Feint, where it cancels the value, it cancels the effect of this card while also being a high enough value to not trigger Umbra. And those cards are far and few between. So this card is almost always going to take a block and another card away from your opponent, which is just crazy for gaining hand advantage, and it's nuts. Basically, both of these cards are pretty nuts. These are like each hero's signature card. Every other card in the deck is any. And I think these are the only boost 3s in your deck, which will matter in just a second. But it's nice knowing that while most of the cards in your deck kind of can be used as either hero and kind of have a benefit to using it in a certain way, whereas these cards just like help the character do what they're good at, which is discarding and movement and smacking. Yes, I'm a big fan of this character, if you couldn't tell. One thing I would like to add is that on Hanging Gardens, this ability gets even better with the high ground because it's even more likely to trigger. Just thought I'd mention that. Also on the Marvel item maps, using items can help you get there. So, sheesh. All right. The next card is Channel the Dark. It is a 2-value attack with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says, after combat, if Cloak played this card, place the opposing fighter adjacent to Dagger and gain 1 action. So let's get something out of the way. You should probably not use this card as Dagger, because as Dagger, it is a blank 2, which usually will do nothing. That reminds me. All of your cards in this deck that you can attack with or defend with are at least value 2 or higher, which means if your opponent ever takes an attack, Umbra or Refraction will trigger, which is great because that means your opponent always has to respect your attacks. And certain decks like Wukong or Electra or Robin Hood that have just small token sidekicks that they don't really want to defend, they get punished for not defending them, which I think will really help them, Cloak and Dagger, in those matchups. Oh my god, words are hard, but that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. So Channel the Dark, it's basically a cloak only attack, and it says after combat, if Cloak played this card, place the opposing fighter adjacent to Dagger and gain 1 action. This card is great for a number of reasons. 1, when your opponent tries to value block Cloak to avoid having to discard a card, this is a really nice bait attack because it basically says, okay, sure, you value block this. I'm getting the action back, and I'm also moving you adjacent to the character that you probably want to be value blocking more than Cloak. And the ability to move the opposing fighter is insane on an attack card because let's say you're playing against Bullseye or just any character with like Skirmish or Leap Away with a bunch of after combat movement effects. You play Channel the Dark and your opponent plays Toil and Danger. And so Sinbad moves away from you. Well, the defender resolves first, their movement will resolve, and then you just move them right back next to Cloak. Or next to Dagger, I should say. What happened in the game that I realized the power of this card was I was playing as Bullseye against Zero Skater 12's Cloak and Dagger. And I was in a scenario where Bullseye was pinned between Cloak and Dagger. And Cloak attacked me with Channel the Dark. I played Tactical Retreat. I moved away, and Zero moved me right back into the pin. Cloak attacked me again with Channel the Dark. I played Master Strategist. I moved away. Zero put me right back in the pin. And that was when I was like, this card is nuts. This card is a really good way to kind of, not counter, but there are some heroes in the game that rely on movement effects on their cards so that they don't get double attacked. And this card basically gives those cards a huge middle finger. This card is really good. And it doesn't look like it at first, but it's basically free. It doesn't cost you an action. And if it gets canceled, well, there are some other card effects that probably your opponent wants to cancel more than this. Although this, because of how good this card is, like, it still is good to cancel. But this is just a really strong bait attack, and it can help you set up some amazing things, especially depending on your opponent's block package. It's phenomenal. The next card is Into the Void. It is a 2-value attack, any. All the cards are going to be any from here on out, so I'm not going to specify that a lot. It has a boost value of 1 and 3 copies, and it says during combat, you may boost this attack. So this is a second shot, but the Muldoon edition, not the Medusa edition, which I think is fine, considering that these characters have an ability to do with combat damage, and if this was a base 3 second shot, it would be much too easy for them to do that. So this is a second shot, and it's a lot better than normal second shots because of Umbra and Refraction, but the boost values in your deck make it a little hard to trigger that. Dark Force Dimension and Light Force Barrage are the only 3s. Everything else in your deck is going to be a 2 or a 1. So a lot of times I think you're going to end up not boosting with this card, but that's okay because in that case it probably means your opponent played like a 4 and you're fine using this as essentially like a bait into that like decent value block. So it's a solid card. your ability makes it good, but your boost values make it less good. So I think it's just all right in general. But it is a nice card to have because it means if your opponent ever like takes an attack thinking it's Channel the Dark, and they're like, it's 2 damage, I'm just going to get attacked again anyway, so I'll just take this one. Well, you can throw it into the void, and then you can deal an undefended 4 or 5 and still make your opponent discard a card. And so that is, again, really good. This character, I feel like it's kind of like walking on a tightrope because there's a lot of ways for it to go wrong, like using Light Force Barrage too early or like getting one of your characters nuked early. But the exhilaration you get from perfectly balancing, we're going to come back to that, from perfectly balancing on the tightrope and making it across is incredible. And the next card is Commanding Impact. This is a familiar face. I love the art on this one because Dagger's just like, they look so majestic, but it's Commanding Impact. 5 value attack, boost value of 2, and you have 3 copies of it. And it says after combat, draw a card. We've seen this card before in Luke Cage, T-Rex, and Sinbad's decks. And this is a sentiment shared by basically everyone who has played this deck at this point, that this is the best feeling Commanding Impact. Because 5 value attacks, pretty good. And I'd say at least half the time, if not more than that, you're going to be dealing 2 damage with this. Which means Umbra and Refraction are going to take effect. Which means this Commanding Impact basically reads, after combat, draw a card. Your opponent discards a card. Or draw a card, gain 1 action. Which is crazy. If you're using this as Cloak, you're pushing the hand advantage up for you by replacing the attack you just played in your hand, while your opponent probably loses a block and another card from your hand. So the difference is now 2. And as Dagger, you can do some crazy things when you have multiple of these in your hand. Because if you play Commanding Impact, draw a card, gain an action, into another Commanding Impact, draw a card, gain an action. This is a key card, I think, in like the Dagger 1-turn kill finisher strategy, because it helps you draw into more options that you potentially need while being a pretty consistent ability trigger. And another great card for them to have. The next card, and the only blue card in this deck, is called Living Shadow. Sorry, my VORPAL. A little slow with OBS. Me emulating the card art there. It's a 2-value blue with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says, during combat, if Dagger played this card, she swaps spaces with Cloak. Cloak is now the defender, and the value of this card is 4 instead. So like Channel the Dark, this is a card that you probably only want to play as one of your heroes, and that would be Dagger. Because when Dagger plays this, you basically Helm, Snake Root, whatever, swap your fighters, and then Cloak is taking the attack, but now he's blocking for 4, which is a lot better than 2. And that's just a solid way to kind of control who your opponent is attacking, because if they know this card exists, there really isn't a reason for them to go after Dagger in the early game, because you can just swap and now you're blocking much more effectively, which means your opponent early game is probably going to target Cloak, which I think for the most part is fine, because you can either then counter attack back with Cloak and make them discard cards and apply pressure more in that sense of the value game, or you can just push Dagger into them and throw a bunch of attacks with Dagger at them, and if they attack Dagger back, well, you just swap with Cloak, and now Cloak is like a solid value blocker. So it makes your opponent a little bit more predictable, I think, and that is good for you. Now, this card isn't very good into offensive cancels like Surprise Attack or the Cancel Jeet, but even then it's only taking 1 damage from the Cancel Jeet, but I'm sure there are other offensive cancels that probably wreck this card, especially if combined with an item from the Marvel maps or High Ground. But it's just not a great card if Cloak is playing this, because it's just a blue 2 with no effect. And if it gets canceled and Dagger's taking the damage over the no effect 2, that's also not good. So just be aware that there are some certain scenarios where this card is not good, but I think for the most part, its existence is just solid, and it can kind of make your opponent, it can force them into difficult play patterns for them, and it's just a reliable card for you, I think. The next card is Perfect Balance. So remember when I said this deck is like walking along a tightrope and it's all about trying to balance perfectly? Well, card name for you. It is a 4-value purple with a boost value of 2 and only 2 copies, and it says during combat, if Cloak and Dagger are both adjacent to the opposing fighter, the value of this card is 6 instead. So this card is insane. Basically, it's like Right Hand Man from Buffy's Xander deck, but instead of wanting both of your fighters adjacent, you want both of your fighters adjacent to the opponent, which I think is really good when you have them pinned or pseudo-pinned, where you're basically both flanking them. And it can be easy to set this up with a card like Channel the Dark, where you just put Cloak and Dagger like a space away from each other, and you attack someone with Cloak and just move them into the middle. You gain an action and then can very easily attack them again. And this is another really strong card to put in the Dagger like combo finishing turn, because it's a 6-value. In this case, you're attacking with it. It's a 6-value attack, which almost always will deal 2 damage. And if they cancel it, well, it's still a printed 4. So against feints and stuff, it's still going to deal 2 damage. So it's a pretty reliable Umbra or Refraction effect getter. And combined with Commanding Impact, personal anecdote time. I shared how I got wrecked by Zero Skater 12 playing this character. There was one game I was playing Chocolate Rain's Miss Marvel, and I literally attacked him 5 or 6 times and killed him from max health with like all 3 commanding impacts, a perfect balance, and like a light force barrage. And it was insane. So I think you want to save this card to be able to attack with it, because it is just a reliable discard or a reliable action gain. But if you can set it up defensively, it's a defensive 6, which is really good for low HP threshold characters. Sometimes a little overkill, but even if you're not triggering the balance, it's still a printed 4 on defense, which is still solid for characters that probably could use a little bit of help defensively anyway. So this is another very strong card that they have in their arsenal. It's only 2 copies, but it would be busted if they had 3. The next card is the Living Light. This is like one of my favorite cards thematically for this deck, and you'll see why after I explain the effect. It's a 3-value purple with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies, and it says after combat, if Cloak played this card to defend, Dagger recovers 2 health. If Dagger played this card to attack, Cloak recovers 2 health. So this is another like card with a choice. I love cards with choices. And basically, if you're using this card as a character in the way that like they normally would want to use cards, so as Dagger, if you're attacking, or as Cloak, you're defending, you get a bonus, and it helps the other hero, which I love the way this card works. So if you defend with this card as Cloak, Dagger recovers 2 health. And if you attack with this card as Dagger, Cloak recovers 2 health. So this is a great way to kind of offset early pressure that one of your characters can get. If Cloak takes a bunch of damage early, well, you can just throw this out as an attack from Dagger and heal him back up. I think it's more reliably triggered as Cloak just because offensive cancels are rare in this game. It's a lot more likely for your opponent to be playing a feint on defense than it is offense. So a lot of times if Dagger attacks with this, it's probably more likely to be canceled than if Cloak is defending with this. But I do think using it as Dagger is probably going to be wanted more often, just because with like Living Shadow, you're putting Cloak in harm's way a little bit more often, and that can lead him to take some damage earlier in the game. But ideally you have Dagger take a hit or two early, and then Cloak can almost automatically heal that back up. That might be a reason you go for an early aggressive Light Force Barrage, because if you have like one of these in your starting hands as well, you know that you can basically, if you can force your opponent to attack Cloak somehow, either with positioning or like if they attack into Living Shadow, like there's a double attack and the first attack goes into Living Shadow, you can play this pretty reliably on the second attack. So that's an interesting interaction to plan for against Volume 2 characters. But just if you have this in your starting hand and you know that you can heal Dagger, like sure, why not throw the 7 on the first turn? Although it is only 2 health, so don't get too carried away. But I really like the way this card works, and with 2 copies, that's 4 total healing split between the characters however you see fit. So 3 value blocks, nothing to scoff at on defense, but isn't the best in the world, but it's a lot better than a 3 value attack, which usually won't trigger Umbra or Refraction. So pretty solid card, although it might have some trouble working in the way you want it to. Depends on the game state. And the next card is Into Darkness. Oh boy, I'm not good at... I have like no coordination in my hands, so... close enough. Oh, I need to do perfect balance as well. Easy. So Into Darkness. It's a 3 value block with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies, and it says after combat, choose one of the fighters in the combat and move them up to 3 spaces. So this is like Toil and Danger and Skirmish combined. It's a very solid card. Basically, being able to move one of the fighters in the combat. I think it's normally going to be your opponent, but it could also be your fighter, depending on whatever's more convenient. But moving your opponent is a great way to set up cards like Perfect Balance, where you pull your opponent in. If they're like a ranged character making an attack, you can pull them in to that like Perfect Balance flanking position, and then set up like a nice Channel the Dark, Perfect Balance shenanigans turn. 3 spaces is also, I don't want to say a lot, obviously, because it's not, but it's more than like the typical 2 that some movement cards have, which is very nice. And this is just like a really solid anti-range defense card, because a lot of times if you're getting attacked by a melee character, like the effect probably won't matter, but against a ranged character, being able to move your fighter up to them or pull them back to you will be very useful. I like that you have 3 copies of this. I think this is a solid card in some matchups, although in some like melee matchups it might not matter as much, but being able to like push them away after attacking with this card or something like that, it can help you kite in useful ways, or can prevent being attacked twice in a turn. So useful card. The next card is Traverse the Dark Force. It is a 2 value purple with a boost value of 1 and 2 copies. And it says after combat, move each of your fighters up to 2 spaces. So this is probably the weakest card in your deck, just because when you attack with it, if your opponent blocks it all, it's not going to trigger Umbra or Refraction. And when you're defending with it, it is just a 2 value block and you're playing it for an 8 health character. So they're going to take some damage, and like this normally won't save their life. Not great. And the after combat effect is all right, I think. Moving each of your fighters up to 2 spaces, it's very nice to be able to move both of your fighters, especially if you're playing this on defense. Against a ranged character, you can move both of your fighters up and set up some surprise balance positioning. But again, like 2 spaces isn't that much, but is like a slightly half decent effect, because you can set up some surprise things on your opponent. But the way I see this card, it's basically like Blessed by Hermes from Achilles' deck, but like worse in every way, because it's a 2. You're only moving your fighters 2 spaces, and you can't move them through opposing fighters. So it's just like an all right card, and having 2 copies is fine, because I don't think you'd want 3. But yeah, it's a card. The next card is Chosen Fate. This is the one and only scheme this deck has. Come on, laptop. I'm getting a new computer soon, so if it seems like I'm on the struggle bus, we're getting off at the next stop. Chosen Fate. It's a boost value of 1, 2 copies, and it says deal up to 4 damage to one of your fighters. Your other fighter recovers that amount of health. Draw 2 cards. So this is the way that you can manipulate the health of your heroes and kind of like pass health from one to the other. Obviously, dealing damage to one of your fighters is unideal, but like if Cloak is at 1 and Dagger's at 8, bringing Dagger down to 4 or 5 and Cloak up to 4 or 5 is good, because like I said before, having both of your heroes on the board makes you a lot better, and your chances of winning go down significantly when one of your fighters is defeated. Also, an interesting interaction this card has is, I believe, this is how it works. People left comments on the first version of my video pointing this out, because I think people were talking about it in the rules channel of the Discord. But if one of your fighters is at 1 health, you can choose to deal 4 damage to them, and your other fighter should recover 4 health because of the way that like overkill damage works. And we've seen this with things like Disarming Shot from Robin Hood's deck, where when Robin Hood plays Disarming Shot on a 1 health sidekick and the sidekick doesn't defend, that sidekick is said to have taken 4 damage, so Robin Hood draws 4 cards. So people are using that same logic here with this, and if Cloak is at 1 and you deal him 4 damage, well, Dagger should recover 4 health, which might be able to get you out of a pinch if both of your characters are really low. But I think you'd have to win relatively soon or have some sort of out. Otherwise, you'll probably just lose anyway because one of your fighters is dead. And of course, you can't forget that this card also has the effect of drawing 2 cards, which is a really good way to push hand advantage, which is something that this character likes to do. This character, there's 2 characters. This is like the Jekyll and Hyde scenario where it's like I don't know whether to be like a singular or a plural, because like yes, they are 2 people, there's 2 heroes, but like every other like heroes deck gets talked about like a character. So like I'm stupid. I get it. I'm a silly little goose. But what were we talking about? Drawing cards. It can be a really good way to like refill your hand first action, so that you have like options for just like throwing more attacks at your opponent. But also, I like having it as a backup plan if you're like playing pretty aggressively, maybe at like a lower hand count, like 3 or 4, attacking with Cloak or Dagger just to like gain more actions and throw cards at your opponent, hoping that they won't have enough blocks to block them all, or just going for discards to punish your opponent for playing at a low hand count. Having this as kind of like a backup plan in case you go too low or just need to quickly go back up. Drawing 2 cards is a very solid option, and it is independent of any damage you deal, although up to 4 damage also means you can do 0, so you can literally just play this card to do nothing else but draw cards. And I think it's scary. Like Light Force Barrage, it's powerful, but like there is a drawback. But I think, like Tightrope Walking, when you're playing as this character, you have to be used or get used to putting yourself in risky, dangerous, and uncomfortable scenarios, because when you're at the brink of disaster is when amazing things can happen. And that's probably how I would best describe playing this character. And lastly, the last card in this deck is everyone's favorite F word, Feint. 3 copies. Hopefully by now you know how this card works. Unless this is your first Unmatched video, in which case, welcome to the community. I promise every video of mine is as weird as this one. Standard cancel package. It's good. Yeah, I guess I don't really know what else to add about this character, or what Feint adds, because it adds the same thing that it adds in every game. So what do I think about this character? Well, if it isn't clear already, I love this character. This is my favorite of the set. It's probably my favorite non-Bullseye Marvel hero. And how good do I think they're going to be competitively? So this is probably a hot take. Probably not a popular opinion, but I think this character is going to be really good. They're not going to be S tier by any means, and they are like a little swingy and inconsistent, but they can do some amazing things, and I think they're going to be Little Red level, where they do decently well into like the top tiers of the meta, but kind of struggle against like the other A's and B's. And let me expand on that, because I know that sounds a little crazy. Cloak and Dagger do really well against characters with bullshit token sidekicks that just wall you off and try to like not engage you with their hero. Because when Cloak and Dagger attack those sidekicks, normally characters like Wukong and Elektra and Medusa don't always block for them. And Umbra is really punishing in those scenarios, because you're still getting value out of that combat from killing the sidekick, in addition to killing the sidekick, because your opponent has to spend a card and discard it, which can be really good into Wukong and Elektra, especially because Elektra's sidekicks only have 2 block cards, and there's 3, or they're 3 value. So if you play something like a Commanding Impact, that's like a guaranteed Umbra discard, and most of the time Elektra's not even going to block, so you could even throw something like Traverse the Dark Force at it, which you're not normally going to be blocking with anyways, and it's just like a nice extra attack. And you can really mess up Elektra's hand first life, so that her resurrection turn maybe is less ideal for her. Same with Wukong. You're going to make him actually like have to defend his clones. That's great for you. They also do well against characters that can't value block super well, because that just makes them even more susceptible to Umbra and Refraction, depending on how you want to play that. So characters like Houdini, he has a lot of low value bad blocks, and Sherlock especially will block for 3 more often than not, and you can really punish him with cards like these. So if I'm going to be wrong about any character, I'm going to be wrong swinging for the fences and say that this character is going to do pretty well into the high tiers, but I can see how they would struggle into like the other high mid tiers like Moon Knight or Achilles or Alice or T-Rex, or the characters just hit really hard because they don't have incredible value blocks, and obviously like the low HP threshold per hero is a little scary against some of the more hard-hitting heroes. So I said, I think they're going to be like Little Red level, but I could just be completely wrong about that. And if they're not good into the upper tiers, they're going to be like C tier, I think. But we're going to be ambitious and say high B. I also think this character probably demolishes Little Red, because you could just very easily nuke the Huntsman. And it's like, sure, I'll play Light Force Barrage into a Stones. This will just like deal enough damage to refract, and then, oh, I have 2 actions and you're defending with Huntsman off suit. Off symbol, I mean. So, yeah, I think you just like nuke the Huntsman in that matchup, and and go to town from there. But like I think this character can do some disgusting things in certain matchups, like against Squirrel Girl. They just farm squirrels, get a bunch of discards. They stomp Bullseye, even going second, but maybe that is a little map dependent, at least on Navy Pier. They stomp Bullseye going first or second from what I found. And I think this character could do some amazing things, and I am willing to walk on that tightrope, and I hope you try it out too, because it is a ton of fun. So those are my first impressions of Cloak and Dagger. Let me know what you think of them in the comments, what cards you like, what combos you see, what matchups you think they're going to be good in, and if I'm completely wrong about my take on them. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I promised that I would clarify why this is the second time this video was out. Basically, I recorded, edited, uploaded, ready to go the first impressions that I had originally for these characters, but I was using old assets with unfinalized wordings, which was just a big mistake on my part because I should have checked that. And so a lot of the cards I had were functionally the same, but the wording was wrong, and that created a lot of confusion, especially in the Discord. And I really regret that, because in my mind, I kind of soured how people were meeting these characters, because instead of like thinking more about like how the cards work, they were thinking about how the card works and like asking questions about the difference in wording versus like what it actually does. And I felt really bad about that. And so this video is coming out later than I thought it would. And this is the second time some of you are seeing this, just because I needed to redo everything with the proper and up-to-date components. So that is a huge my bad. And I'm really sorry for what any confusion that caused for people, because I know it did. And so I hope you aren't too disappointed in me and in the, yeah. So we're definitely not going to let that ever happen again. And you learn. So yes, everything is a learning experience, and we'll make my videos better in the future because of that. So yeah, thank you for watching. Sorry about the, yeah. And as always, like, subscribe, and yay!